By the time Gary Brooker reached the final years of his life, a whiter shade of pale had already become a cultural monument, an anthem wrapped in symbolism, drifting between the real and the surreal. People quoted it, analyzed it, and argued about it, yet no one could claim to truly understand it. Brooker had always dodged giving a definitive meaning, letting listeners interpret the song in their own way. But in one of his last major reflections, he finally opened up. What he shared didn't solve the riddle. It twisted it in a direction few saw coming. And suddenly, the song's most puzzling lines took on a startling new significance. How Gary Brooker's journey truly began. The story begins in East London in the spring of 1945, when Gary Brooker entered the world at Hackney Hospital. He spent his earliest years in Hackney before the family made their way out to Middlesex, settling first in Bush Hill Park and later in Edmonton. Music was already woven into his life from the start. His father, Harry Brooker, worked as a professional musician and played steel guitar with Felix Mendelssohn's Hawaiian Serenaders. Growing up with that influence, Gary found himself drawn to instruments early on, learning piano, cornet, and trombone with a natural ease. Everything shifted again in 1954 when the Brookers moved to the seaside town of Southend-on-Sea in Essex. Gary attended Westcliff High School for boys during these years, but tragedy arrived far too soon. At just 11 years old, he lost his father to a heart attack. With the family suddenly under strain, his mother returned to work, and Gary supported them the best way he could, taking up a paper route to help keep things steady. When he finished school, his path initially seemed headed in a very different direction. He enrolled at Southend Municipal College to study zoology and botany, but the pull of music was stronger than any textbook. It didn't take long before he dropped out to pursue what he already knew was his true calling, becoming a professional musician. In the early 1960s, Gary teamed up with Robin Trower and B.J. Wilson to form the Paramounts. For a period, they even worked as the backing band for Sandy Shaw, one of the major British pop voices of the time. Like many young British bands of their generation, the Paramounts were deeply inspired by the raw, soulful energy of American R&B. Their first single in 1963 was a spirited cover of The Coasters' Poison Ivy, followed by a version of Bad Blood, and a handful of original tracks co-written by Brooker and Trower. They weren't alone in this wave of reinterpretation. The Beatles were finding success with Chuck Berry covers, and the Animals were reshaping traditional songs like House of the Rising Sun. But the tide soon turned. Bands began moving away from simply covering American records and started discovering their own voices through original songwriting. This shift helped spark the British invasion that would go on to dominate the global charts. Even though fellow musicians admired the Paramount's blues-driven sound, mainstream chart success never landed their way. Brooker later admitted that he became discouraged during this period, but in that disappointment came a spark. He decided it was time to take songwriting into his own hands, and that decision led him to a vital partner, lyricist Keith Reid. At first, Brooker and Reid intended to write songs for other artists, but they quickly realized that their material was so unusual, so distinct, that if it was ever going to reach the world, they would need to perform it themselves. After the Paramounts dissolved, Brooker stepped forward to form a new group built around his piano, his voice, and Reid's evocative, often mysterious lyrics. As this fresh lineup came together, they found themselves in need of a name. According to Brooker, they didn't even choose one. Their manager called one day with a suggestion he'd stumbled upon: Procol Harum. It was unusual, it was striking, and, as Gary would later say, it somehow sounded exactly like the music they were beginning to create. The name actually came from the pedigree of a friend's cat, though it had been misheard over the phone. The Latin form of the name was Procol Harum, meaning beyond these things. The band embraced it instantly. It fit their sound, their mood, and the sense of mystery they were building. By this point, the band's lineup was fully taking shape. Gary Brooker stepped forward as the pianist and lead vocalist, with Keith Reid serving as the behind-the-scenes lyricist. Matthew Fisher brought his iconic organ work, David Knights handled bass duties, Ray Royer played guitar, and Bobby Harrison joined on drums. Amid the explosion of British invasion bands in the 1960s, Procol Harum stood out in a way few others did. Their music captured a dreamy, atmospheric quality that seemed to embody the summer of love more vividly than most of their peers. Today, the sound might come across as gentle, but back then, it was bold, different, and even a little unsettling to older listeners. Meanwhile, younger audiences found themselves drawn into its hazy beauty, its depth, and its emotional weight. What truly separated Procol Harum from the pack was their willingness to draw inspiration from places far outside the typical rock palette. Their music leaned into classical influences, poetic storytelling, and an almost philosophical melancholy. Those choices became their superpower. It allowed this group from Essex to carve out a space all their own, a place where their distinctive sound and lush emotional tones could unfold into something unforgettable. The accidental melody that changed everything. Procol Harum's arrival on the world stage came with remarkable force in 1967, thanks to their debut single, A Whiter Shade of Pale. It wasn't just another psychedelic track floating through the haze of the summer of love. It quickly became one of those rare songs that leave a permanent mark on pop music history, the kind of record people still point to when talking about era-defining moments. From the very beginning, the band knew they had something special. Keith Reid, the group's lyricist, later recalled how thrilled they all felt while shaping their first batch of songs. As they practiced, this particular track rose above the rest. It simply sounded right. And when the band stepped into the studio for their first recording session, they cut 4 songs. But A Whiter Shade of Pale stood out by far as the strongest recording. Back then, success wasn't just about writing a great tune. Everything depended on how well that tune could be captured on tape. With studios being less forgiving and most sessions recorded essentially live, a song could easily fall flat without the right engineering or equipment. Fortunately, that day everything clicked. The performance, the sound, the atmosphere, it all came together, and that magic carried straight onto the record. Beyond its dreamy organ line and hypnotic rhythm, the real mystery lies in the lyrics. The song often feels like a swirl of vivid, disconnected images, visions that don't follow a strict narrative and often drift into outright surrealism. Lines seem to leap from one idea to another, and the meaning shifts like a dream just before waking. But for anyone who understood what the band was exploring at the time, this wasn't random at all. Reid wasn't trying to build a clear storyline. He was chasing emotions, those slippery, overwhelming feelings that defy ordinary language. Many of the phrases were intentionally abstract, meant to express sensations rather than literal ideas. In a way, the lyrics captured the moment perfectly. The whole song echoed the vibe of the summer of love, a time when young people felt strangely connected to the universe, sometimes with a little psychedelic help. But honestly, it's the story behind the melody that really gets interesting. While Keith Reid was developing material for Procol Harum's first album, he often found himself lingering around Gary Brooker as he experimented on the keyboards. Bits of melody drifted through the room, and Reid began noticing how certain musical fragments seemed to fit perfectly with the lines he was writing. One of those musical moments was born from what can only be described as a beautiful mistake. Brooker was attempting to play the opening section of Bach's Air on a G string, but he lost his place in the sheet music and veered off. That slip sent him down an entirely new path, one that led directly to the haunting organ figure that would become the spine of A Whiter Shade of Pale. At the same time, Reid had already been shaping an evocative line he had overheard at a party. A whiter shade of pale stayed with him, eventually inspiring a full set of lyrics built around that one unforgettable phrase. Reed later explained that he approached the song less as a straightforward narrative and more as an attempt to create a mood. He wanted to paint a scene filled with vivid sensations, the ceiling drifting away, the room humming, ideas meant to stir emotion rather than follow strict logic. Although many listeners assumed he must have been deep in psychedelic experiences to craft such imagery, Reed insisted he drew his inspiration from books and films, not books. He admitted he may have been smoking when the idea first sparked, but the writing itself came from a place of observation and imagination, not indulgence. Brooker's musical contributions amplified that dreamlike feeling. His organ arrangement felt both fresh and strangely familiar, echoing his own growing passion for classical music and jazz. After years of playing rock and R&B, his creative horizons had widened. When he first saw Reed's 4 long stanzas of lyrics, he immediately sensed their potential. He happened to be sitting at the piano, working through a musical idea, and within a couple of hours the words and the melody had found their natural fit. He would later call moments like these gifts, brief flashes where everything aligns. The classical flavor of the music wasn't intentional so much as instinctive. Brooker noted that if one traces the chord progression, it brushes briefly against Bach's air before moving into new territory. That small influence was enough to give the song its Baroque undertone, all without forcing a conscious blend of rock and classical traditions. The lyrics themselves were shaped by Reed's fascination with French cinema of the 1950s and 60s. He spent countless hours at the Academy Cinema on Oxford Street, watching films like Pierrot le Fou and Last Year in Marienbad. Their fragmented storytelling, surreal visuals, and drifting moods deeply influenced his writing style. Surrealist painters such as Magritte and Dali left a similar impression. At the same time, major musical voices of the decade, Ray Charles, the Beatles, and especially Bob Dylan, encouraged him to play with language. Dylan's approach to mixing imagery and emotion inspired Reed to pursue atmosphere over structure, allowing his lyrics to move fluidly between dream and reality. What makes a whiter shade of pale extraordinary is the balance it achieves. On paper, Reed's phrases might have collapsed into pure abstraction, but instead they formed a loose, almost cinematic story. Listeners could sense characters, a room, a journey. Reed himself described the writing as an attempt to capture the feel and even the scent of a moment. Though non-linear, the lyrics follow an emotional thread rather than a logical one. The earliest draft contained 4 verses, but when he heard how Brooker had shaped the first 3, he knew the 4th was unnecessary. The story already felt complete. The recording process carried its own drama. The first version was captured at Olympic Studios in London with session drummer Bill Iden. A later attempt using the band's own drummer, Bobby Harrison, simply didn't land with the same impact. Ultimately, they returned to one of the original mono recordings, produced by Denny Cordell, for the final release. When the song arrived in May 1967, some worried that its heavy organ sound and powerful drums might struggle on radio playlists, but those fears evaporated almost immediately. Within 2 weeks, it rose straight to number 1, holding the top spot for 6 weeks, and effectively launching the Summer of Love. It wasn't just a hit, it was everywhere. Its bold blend of Baroque influence, emotional depth, and gentle experimentation made it stand apart from the usual pop singles of the era. By July, A Whiter Shade of Pale had become the best-selling song in the world, winning praise even from famously tough critics like John Lennon. More importantly, it defined a new musical identity on the spot: classical rock. The curse behind a perfect hit. At the height of A Whiter Shade of Pale's explosive success, the band itself was already unraveling behind the scenes. Personnel changes were happening fast. 2 members were out, 2 fresh faces from the Paramounts were in, and just as the world finally decoded the meaning of the band's mysterious name, their reign at #1 had already slipped away. Their breakthrough hit had landed like a musical earthquake, massive, unforgettable, but impossible to recreate. From that moment on, every new single was judged against the colossal shadow of a whiter shade of pale. Hopes for another million seller kept building, but each release only brought more frustration. Their follow-up, Hamburg, performed decently, #6 in the UK, but sputtered out at #34 in the US, nudging the band into cult territory rather than mainstream stardom. Critics didn't help. Some attacked Hamburg for sounding too much like their debut hit. Others complained it didn't sound enough like it. And while all that noise was happening, the band was also wrestling with management problems and more lineup turbulence. But they weren't the only group to struggle with the curse of a towering hit. Even Jefferson Airplane vanished from the charts after their huge 1967 anthems. Still, A Whiter Shade of Pale was the cultural moment of 1967, and it created a standard no human band could realistically match. Back then, the idea of an album band was barely forming. Record labels still lived and breathed singles. So when the group went 5 long years without another hit, many wrote them off. Yet, they kept delivering richly textured, rewarding albums anyway. Part of what made them so compelling was how utterly unmatchable their sound was. Critics kept scrambling for comparisons, tossing out names ranging from the band to the Moody Blues, but none of those labels stuck. Procol Harum existed in their own world, a fusion of gothic classical flourishes and gritty, muscular rock. Every release felt like an emotional event. Their music carried this strange mix of alienation and strength, as if every member was whispering to anyone who felt out of place that they weren't alone. Keith Reid's lyrics were troubled poetry. Gary Brooker's voice soared with a kind of wounded dignity. Barry Wilson's drumming pulsed like a living heartbeat. Matthew Fisher's organ poured out haunted majesty. And Robin Trower's guitar alternated between brooding growls and raw electric shrieks. The lineup on their debut album reassembled much of the Paramounts: Brooker, Trower, and Wilson, with the crucial addition of Fisher on organ. Reid later admitted he loved the songwriting on that first record, even if the actual recording sounded rough and hollow at times. Still, despite those flaws, the album became a sentimental favorite among fans. Fisher's classical organ dominated the atmosphere, while tracks like A Christmas Camel showcased Brooker's pounding piano and his uncanny ability to howl into high registers while still sounding dignified. The themes across the album were almost startling for such a young group: insecurity, mortality, depression. Not surprising, considering the members were reportedly around 18 years old. Reid's lyrics were immediately treated with a seriousness usually reserved for Dylan or Lennon. And while the album had been recorded at breakneck speed, something obvious when compared to its only rival in literary ambition, Sgt. Pepper, the music struck listeners deeply. So by the time fans waited for the band's first true studio album, anticipation was sky high. When Shine On Brightly finally arrived, it was clear it had been crafted with real care. Reid's lyrics kept exploring the unseen and the unknowable, a kind of optimistic surrender to life's mysteries. His line about a befuddled mind shining on brightly captured that perfectly. Musically, the band was evolving fast. Trower's guitar became a sharper, more aggressive force, and Wilson emerged as one of rock's most imaginative drummers. His fills practically stories of their own. The album's centerpiece was the ambitious suite, In Held 'Twas in One, a trailblazing 5-part journey combining deep bass, searing guitar, smoldering organ, spoken word mysticism, and even sound effects. Brooker later remembered how incomplete it was when recording began, and how thrilling it felt to hear it assembled for the first time in the studio late at night. Yet, despite all that creativity, the world didn't quite get Shine On Brightly when it first came out. It was ahead of its time. Only years later did listeners return to the album with fresh ears, telling Reed it felt like something they'd just discovered. It served as a reminder that sometimes brilliance isn't ignored. It just waits for the world to finally catch up. Before death, Gary Brooker revealed what A Whiter Shade of Pale was really about. The band found itself back in the headlines in May 2005, and this time, the spotlight wasn't on a new album or reunion tour, it was on a lawsuit. Matthew Fisher, the group's original keyboardist, stepped forward claiming that his haunting organ solo on A Whiter Shade of Pale earned him a rightful share of the song's royalties. It was the kind of dispute that has played out in countless bands over the years. Everyone starts as friends, chasing the same dream. But once success hits, questions about creative credit and money begin pulling them apart. Procol Harum had crafted something extraordinary with that song, but the legal fight that followed would leave permanent cracks in the group's foundation. To understand how they got there, it helps to rewind. When the band was just beginning to shape its earliest tracks, frontman Gary Brooker had a very specific vision. He wanted a full-time organist who could bring a distinctive sound into the mix. That search led him to Fisher. Brooker was immediately fascinated by the tone Fisher produced, and once they started working together, they stumbled onto the skeleton of what would become their future masterpiece. Brooker could feel it instantly. They had something special. The track had deep classical roots, drawing heavily from Bach's air on a G string. That influence is why the organ sweeps through nearly the entire arrangement, giving the song a smooth, almost regal feel. And when it arrived, just as the summer of love was blooming, it slid seamlessly into the cultural moment, with hits from the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. Much of that magic came from Brooker's soulful delivery, but the spine of the song, the riff that held the whole thing together, came from Fisher. That's where the trouble began. Fisher created the iconic organ melody, yet he received no writing credit. With his name missing from the publishing rights, he only earned the paycheck of a session musician, not the royalties that came with worldwide fame. The spark that pushed him to act came years later, when he noticed a major royalties dispute involving the Bluebells and their hit Young at Heart, which sampled Procol Harum's work. That case made him wonder whether it was time to fight for his own recognition. In 2005, Fisher officially launched his claim. His lawyer, Ian Purvis, argued that the song wasn't just a hit, it was the song of 1967, a defining piece of the summer of love. Purvis leaned heavily into the musical details, emphasizing that Fisher had crafted the unforgettable 8-bar Hammond organ solo that gave the song its baroque, almost ethereal character. In his view, that contribution wasn't just memorable, it was essential. His case was simple. Fisher wrote the entire organ line. Brooker and lyricist Keith Reed fired back with a very different version of events. They insisted the song had been fully written before Fisher ever joined the band in March 1967. Brooker even explained that the melody's inspiration came straight from Bach, referencing air on a G string and sleepers awake. Their lawyers also highlighted one major obstacle for Fisher. He had waited nearly 40 years to bring the matter to court. They called the delay bizarre and obviously prejudicial, arguing it was enough on its own to dismiss his claim. Now, things took a dramatic turn when Matthew Fisher clarified that he wasn't after the money the song had already generated. What he wanted was to secure his share of any future royalties. What made this even more surprising was that he was still on perfectly friendly terms with the band. In fact, after stepping away as a performer, he continued working with them throughout the 1970s, producing several albums and even collaborating with guitarist Robin Trower. So when the lawsuit arrived, it wasn't coming from a bitter ex-member, but from someone who had remained closely connected to the group's creative world. The judge's ruling in December 2006 seemed like a major victory for Fisher. He was granted a songwriting credit and awarded 40% of the song's royalties, moving forward from the date the lawsuit was filed. The court praised the organ part as a distinctive, skillfully crafted contribution, an essential piece of the composition. But even in victory, the situation was strangely murky. The court refused to specify exactly which portion Fisher had authored, leaving both parties unsure about what his credit technically covered. It was a win, but one wrapped in lingering confusion. By 2007, the dispute had become one of the most talked-about music lawsuits of the decade. A Whiter Shade of Pale wasn't just a hit, it was a global phenomenon with roughly 10 million copies sold. Judge William Blackburn ruled that Fisher deserved 40% of the copyright because he composed the haunting organ line that defined the recording. Up to that point, frontman Gary Brooker had been the sole credited copyright holder, so the ruling hit hard. Brooker reacted with real frustration, calling the decision a darker shade of black and warning that it might open the door for countless session musicians to file claims years after recordings were completed. His legal team described the judgment as a ticking time bomb for the music industry. Even though Fisher won recognition, he didn't get everything he hoped for. He was awarded less than the 50% share he sought, and he wasn't entitled to any past royalties. The financial fallout was steep. Brooker's side was ordered to cover 90% of Fisher's legal costs, a bill that could reach £750,000. The payments were paused pending appeal, but the damage was already emotional. Brooker said his faith in the British legal system was shattered and suggested that if Fisher's name was added to the song, his own might as well be removed. He insisted that the true inspiration behind the music came from Bach. The battle didn't end there. In 2008, the Court of Appeal issued a divided ruling. They agreed Fisher deserved credit for creating the melodic line, but overturned the earlier decision granting him 40% of future royalties. The majority argued that Fisher's decades-long delay in filing the claim made it unfair for him to assert control now. One judge dissented, noting that Brooker hadn't shown any real harm from the delay and that nothing in the rules made Fisher's claim unreasonable. Fisher responded by calling the judgment strange and unsatisfying for everyone involved, but he stood by the core of his fight. He had secured authorship credit for the musical feature he believed was the song's defining element. The final twist came in July 2009, when the court ultimately restored Fisher's rights to future royalties. The judges concluded that the long delay hadn't disadvantaged the band at all. If anything, they had benefited from uninterrupted earnings. And, crucially, that English copyright law imposed no time limit on such claims. With that, Fisher's authorship and future royalties were officially protected. But the price was steep. The lawsuit left deep cracks in the group's relationships. While Gary Brooker had long been the public face of the song, the case revealed just how much of its soul came from a musician who, for decades, had lived in its shadow. The credits were finally corrected, but the bond between the band members was never quite the same. The strange accidents that changed everything. Procol Harum's mid-2000s chapter reads almost like a documentary you'd stumble upon late at night. Steady, rhythmic, and full of unexpected twists. The band spent 2006 and 2007 crisscrossing Europe, playing everywhere, from Switzerland to Norway and Denmark. Then suddenly, 2008 fell completely silent, as if someone had pressed pause on their story. Their comeback was supposed to kick off in July 2009 with shows in Norway and Finland, but fate intervened in the most unusual way. Gary Brooker, the soul of the band, took a bad fall off a stack of roadside logs in Finland and broke several ribs. It wasn't until October that he was fully back on his feet, and the moment he recovered, the band jumped straight into 4 shows across Germany, Norway, and Russia. Around that same time, fans received a massive treat: the 4-disc retrospective All This and More. By 2010, Procol Harum was back in full touring mode, hopping between Canada, Italy, Germany, Poland, and the UK before returning to the US to promote The Spirit of Noken. And then came January 2011, 8 shows with the Danish Radio Orchestra, and over 13,000 fans pouring into venues across Denmark. Their 2012 schedule stretched across continents again, taking them to Cape Town, Johannesburg, and back to Denmark. But the South African leg came to a sudden halt. On May 29th, Gary Brooker's 67th birthday, he suffered yet another mysterious fall. Promoters announced the cancellation with heartfelt messages, assuring fans he was receiving excellent care. The band had been scheduled for Cape Town and Johannesburg within days, but recovery had to come first. Still, the story kept moving. In 2013, they returned to Europe, and in 2014, they revisited Canada and the US. Despite their devoted following, none of their 6 post-1999 albums managed to chart in the UK or the States. Yet the lineup, Matt Pegg, Jeff Whitehorn, Gary Brooker, Josh Phillips, and Jeff Dunn, kept performing. They hit stages across Europe in 2015 and had more shows lined up for 2016 and 2017. Then came another unforgettable moment in 2017. During intermission at the Royal Festival Hall, Brooker fell again, returning to the stage with his head bandaged and his hand injured. The crowd, waiting anxiously, erupted into cheers the moment he walked out, even with a broken 5th metacarpal that sidelined him from the keyboard for weeks. Brooker brushed it off with his usual quiet grit. By 2018, the band was back on the road, playing across Europe to celebrate their massive box set, Still There'll Be More. And on April 14th of that year, their timeless classic, A Whiter Shade of Pale, became one of the first songs inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame's singles category. In January 2019, they announced a 13-show North American tour to support their 2017 album, Novum. Brooker expressed how excited he was to bring both new and old material back to American audiences after nearly 5 years. The tour was set to begin in February and wrap in early March. But 2020 had other plans. Like so many artists, their schedule was wiped clean by the pandemic. Then came the heartbreaking news in February 2022. Gary Brooker, the voice and spirit of Procol Harum, passed away at 76 after battling cancer. The band's tribute described a man whose presence lit up rooms, whose humor and eccentric charm made him unforgettable, and whose honesty and character anchored everything Procol Harum ever was. With his passing, the long, winding tale of Procol Harum reached its final chapter. A story filled with soaring music, loyal fans, unexpected setbacks, and a frontman whose legacy will ring out for decades.